While the rest of the 15 communities of historical Albanian diasporas, it is difficult to accurately establish their origin and foundation, we know about Villa Badesa origin. The other Arbëresh settlements of historical Albanian diasporas in southern Italy were created from the merge of crowds of various origins in search of a common fate in foreign land. Regarding the origin of the inhabitants of Villa Badesa in Abruzzo coming from Piceras of the sea coast, a source historically documented, it is also confirmed in an oral tradition that continues to exist in this village of Albania. The founding of the community of Villa Badesa in the province of Pescara dates back exactly to the year 1744 and is one of the last historical Albanian diasporas in Italy. In addition, the facts of the recognition of the origin and the resettlements of this community is well witnessed by the dress used by the group members. The dress both of men and women shows a clear distinction from the other Albanian diaspora, and on the other hand, there is a quite a semblance with the dress of southern Albania. This paper attempts to evaluate from a comparative perspective the factors that influence the preservation of traditional costume memory at Villa Badesa and its loss in the country of origin in Piceras. Documentation of the costume of Villa Badesa through graphic images in different periods and then also through photography shows its historical continuity. In the case of Piceras, according to the Albanian ethnography studies, this dress was subject to changes until the middle of 19th century, and in the years of the First World War, it went out of use. Tracing the historical factors since the migration will enable us to understand the reaction of both communities regarding the traditional dress after it fell out of daily use. Comparison between the process of preservation of costume versus that of loss in language in Villa Badesa, it's part of this paper. Documentation of the costume of Villa Badesa through graphic images. Exactly in 1782, Ferdinand IV promotes an investigation into the traditional costume of the popular classes of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to obtain images with which to decorate the prestigious services of the Capodimonte porcelain factory. Consequently, the image of men's and women's dress of this community is memorized as decoration of these porcelain wares. The same image is obtained in the illustration realized by Del Giudice, which dates back to the end of the 18th and beginning of 9th century. What is clearly observed in these images is the fact that the costume of men as well as the women contains the same elements and the same colors too. At the beginning of 19th century, there is an abundant visual documentation by various authors of dress of Villa Badesa, its reconsideration and reinterpretation. Here we have two of the De Vitos in 1820 and Baez Gruppo in 1826. The illustration by Bartolomeo Pinelli show its reinterpretation published respectively during 1840, 1816, whereby the author brings in the same compositional pattern as in the porcelain images and in those by Del Giudice, but in different colors in these both illustrations. Then the most faithful illustration of woman's dress with reference to the dress in inherited to our days appears in publication of Royal Gallery of Costume in 1842-43. Based on this description and photo images of dress, we are inclined to believe that the intensive colors used in previous illustration have been a personal interpretation of illustrative authors. Furthermore, the materials used for the jacket in the woman's dress is widely used in Albania as well as over the Balkan, a material consisting of a woolen fabric woven at home by women which then was treated over to obtain the felt. This is a tradition which found its proper turf in Abruzzo, thus helping its long survival. Edward Lear, the English painter and writer, described presented in documenting images the dress of Albanian women of Villa Badesa over the period 1843-44. There stresses the influence of the Oriental forms in women's dress of Villa Badesa, which in itself is the major factor of distinction from the dress form of other Arbëresh communities. Thanks to the illustration, it is understood that men's costume was used until the beginning of 19th and at this moment, at the Lear, as a Lear description, it may be said that this costume was used by Albanian men of Villa Badesa for less than a century. The graphic illustration depicts fighting the equipped with Oriental rifles and swords, and evidence of their war engagement in the regiment of Real Macedon. The participation of Albania in the regiment of Real Macedon is a common fact at this period. The regulation of the regiment also determined the costume to be worn by its members. The costume had to be Albanian style. In this case, the costume of Albanian fighters was an element of distinction and pride, which would remain like that for the men of Villa Badesa until the dissolution of the regiment that began in 1799 with the French invasion of the Kingdom of Naples. Photographic documentation. The first photographic image of women's dress of Villa Badesa is dated in 1900. A portrait of 3 female figures in traditional Albanian costume. In 1913-1914, after his first travel to southern Italy to study the Albanian dialects, Maximilian Lamberts went to Abruzzo and Molise, brought several documenting photographs of women's costume at Villa Badesa. In the black and white image, it's clear that the use of costume was reduced to special events. So far, analysis of the visual images show the costume of Villa Badesa viewed from outside the community. The artists, travelers, and researchers considered that Villa Badesa costume was an identifying element of that community. The authors of study Sopravvivenze Linguistiche a Villa Badesa bring out data of census of this community from beginning of 20th century until 2012. This data shows clearly that the number of inhabitants of Albanian origin was continuously decreasing. In addition, there are no longer traces of their ethnic language. This represents a very difficult situation for the survival and ethnic cultural configuration of this community, in that the language, as one of the key distinctive elements, is missing. But ethnic configuration means a mix of elements capable of activating the ethnicity as an operational group. These elements of ethnic configuration vary as per given circumstances and are not all equally presented, but one of or some of them may become more obvious. Furthermore, another important element of this configuration is the traditional costume of Villa Badesa woman, which was reactivated following the foundation of Villa Badesa Cultural Association in 1991. In order to have these elements active, it is necessary that they should be based on the memory and on the investment about it. The column Abiti Tradizionali of Association webpage, apart from visual historic documenting images, had some photos taken in the period from 1935 to 1988 uploaded. So these images positively confirm the survival of this costume as an object and memory until our days. It is exactly these original elements of women's costume as a physical object and that will serve for their reproduction, not only by the community members, but also by researchers outside this community. In this case, the work done by Professor Francesco Stoppa is of an enormous value, not only for the faithful reproduction of women's costume, but primarily for detailing in full the craftsmanship. But in the photographic images, there is uploaded in the association, there is also the man's traditional costume worn either at various cultural events or as a costume for weddings. Although it did not survive until these days as a physical object, the image of this costume visually memorized in the illustration. Furthermore, it seems that the resume of the traditional costume on the wedding days conveys to its users a stronger identity pertainance. It appears that the strongest identity element, the Byzantine rite of marriage, needs a stronger supporting visual configuration, and nothing other than the traditional costume can do it better. In this case, the costume, as a form of non-verbal language, assumes the importance of the verbal language, even surpasses it. The traditional costume of picheras. Picheras is part of the lower coast. Women's dress in this ethnographic neighborhood, which was in use until the first half of the 19th century, is barely remembered only among the old people. The dress pertains to the type of dress with two aprons, and this element are almost similar to this of the woman dress of Villa Badesa. The dress was homemade, and the use of woolen thread in many elements of dress was primarily a characteristic of those villages whose economy was based mainly in raising livestock. The development of the olives culture increased the trade at home and abroad. By the middle of 19th century, picheras was a considerable increase in the number of merchant ships. The changes in the economic structure would bring about a laxity of the natural economy and the replacement of the village costume with one of the city origin, which was the long skirt with a peshli. This costume, which had already become a ceremonial costume, would be gradually replaced by a Western-style urban costume. The main factor that influenced were the economic downfall and immigration from the coast areas to Western countries. One of the inhabitants tell that the skirt was called rochet, the blouse was called polk, and the kerchief was called destamel. This designation came along with the elements of clothes brought from foreign markets or with the fabric used for their reproduction. Shkurti ranks men's costume chronologically as follows. Even the folkloric festival of Girocastra, where the folkloric group from Picheras participated, the woman's costume was not displayed complete. This festival was a cultural event organized by the Social State Science in 1968 every 5 years. The Picheras folk costume were designed by the State Artistic Wear Enterprise in a Saranda of Lora. An image presents the Picheras folkloric group, and the women's dress is a schematic and stereotyped dress, common for almost all villages along the coast. The kind of dress hardly brings to mind the city origin costume with a long skirt and peshli. Comparison between the process of preservation of costume versus that of loss of language in Villa Badesa. In his studies on the language used in Villa Badesa, Lamberts observed its special place among all the Arbëresh dialects. He sees it very similar to the language used in the country of origin, with fewer Italian borrowings compared to the Arbëresh dialects in southern Italy. He also notes that the language in Badesa is dying out while resisting to become a mixed language. The evidence from Villa Badesa traditional female costume reveals similarities to the folk dress with two aprons in Albania. Just like in the language realm, it was not affected by the local culture and vanished from everyday use without becoming a mixed dress. In the folk songs collected by Lamberts, we see the name of some elements of the female costume in Villa Badesa, such as Tsohën e Kuqe, Me futo që ndisura, me grikës të lisura, Destemel, a sort of head kerchief. This word, borrowed from Turkish, continues to be the term used in Picheras even after the clothing with two apron went out of use. The PERTA identified the critical level of language decline in Villa Badesa when it gave the first sign and the following chronological course of its irreversible deterioration until its complete loss. This is due to several typical factors such as mixed marriages, high mobility within Italy, migration both at home and abroad. It is the same situation with the traditional clothing. After its decline from everyday use, it was used less and less. But unlike the language, the traditional costume has been revived in both its material and intangible dimension. Following Lambert's documentation, some of the names of the clothing items were reflected by the Francesco Stoppa as linea, giub, futa. The list of the clothing terms presented by Stoppa, it's not in complete set, which shows that some of them may have been lost. He mentioned only those terms he has been able to trace. Those Stoppa tries to revive the traditional female costume in both dimensions, as material heritage, as intangible heritage. The intangible heritage of the costume implies not only the process of craftsmanship, but also the communication of the symbolism it contains, which is actualized through its use. Communication as such in the memory that speaks is the memory that speaks, and as an element of the intangible dimension, it leads to the revival of the traditional costume of both women and men at Villa Badesa. This memory relied on both the clothing itself, stored as an object and the visual documentation. However, we see a different situation regarding the language in Villa Badesa. The authors of studies sopravvivenze linguistiche, there is no longer point out that there is no longer a communication space reserved for Arbëresh, and there are no traces of ethnic language documentation. The provision for the communication space will require the constant reconstruction, and the exercise of group memory through specific and visual references as in the case of clothing. I want to thank you with this image from Villa Badesa today.